So we're going to explore more about this Copernican revolution, a different way of taking the tradition and making sense of it. And I want to just remind you of a metaphor that we used last time that I find very helpful. We're all born into a world where the dots are the dots, but there's no manual that tells us how to connect them or in what order. And how you connect the dots determines the pattern that you see. It determines the drawing that becomes visible. So what order in your mind you impose on the world shapes what you then see in the world. A world of coercive power, and you start to see that if that's your ideology. But remember, what process theology starts with is the assumption that the world is not made up of solid objects that interact with coercive external force. That instead, the key to understanding the actual universe we live in is that we live in a world of shimmering interactive patterns of energy, and that these patterns of energy are resilient across time. That is to say, they mostly stay the same. But of course, all things also change. So at every instant, everything in creation and all of creation is born anew. We saw that in the Machzor over the holidays. We see that in the prayer book, that God renews God's newness, God's novelty at each and every moment. Mechadesh betuvo b'chol yom tamid, every single day. So in this universe that is constantly recreated, in which each of us are constantly created, there's a fluctuation back and forth in which we are, what choice do we want to make to move into the future? And we're faced with more than one choice because the future is open. There are multiple possibilities facing each one of us at this precise moment. And so you get to decide, am I going to stay online or am I going to get offline? Am I going to stay online, but I'm going to switch to a sports show, or I'm going to watch a rabbi? Do I want to eat while I'm watching or not? Like, there's a whole bunch of choices we make at every moment. And one of those choices is, according to process thought, the lure, the optimal next choice, the best possible choice you could make. And it's optimal in terms of love and justice and relationship and experience. And so you can choose the lure, and then that becomes a permanent part of your journey forward. That helps determine what the future will be. And when you make your choice, that becomes data for everybody else to make their choice. My goodness, everyone is abandoning this class. I guess I should too, right? So the universe fluctuates between everything makes its choice, and those choices become data by which everything else makes their choice. Our choices are impacted by the choices of the rest of creation. Everything is always counterbalancing and integrating the world around it. But at no point do you ever lose your freedom, your ability to decide for yourself what choice you're going to make. Now, there are things from the past that help shape the choice. The fact that I'm a 61-year-old man, the fact that I've been married to the same woman for 38 years, the fact that I was a rabbi in Mission Viejo for 10 years before I came to these are all things that I can no longer change. They are fixed parts of my journey, which means there are some things that I won't be able to choose now. I will never be a world-class basketball star. That choice is gone. I will never be, I don't know, senator from California. But I could make other choices. I could decide I don't want to write another book, or I do. I could decide I want to take up a new sport or not. There are lots of choices that meet the past that I have constructed at this moment, and there's multiple possibilities which I get to choose. At each and every moment, everything in creation has that too. We stand on the pinnacle of the past we have lived, and we then make the choice that links that past with a particular future. One potential future will become real. And God is there to give us an intuition, that's called the lure, of the optimal next choice. And God also empowers us to choose to make that choice, but never forces us, right? I'll remind you of something we said last time too. God does not and cannot break the rules. So the same laws of physics constrain God. The laws of nature constrain God. God works inside of nature with us through nature, encouraging us and the universe to continue to move from chaos to cosmos, from disorder to order, to heightened relationship. And that's the key of process theology, what I've just said to you. A God who cannot break the rules, who does not use coercion, who respects the interiority, the self-determination of every creature and of all creation. Okay? That kind of brings us up to date with where we are so far. And now I want to move into a more contentious area. I want to talk about the relationship between science and religion. For those of you who want the religious category that fits, we're going to talk about creation. What can someone who doesn't believe in a supernatural, all-powerful, all-knowing God who's 100% in control say about the physical world around us? Because then what is God doing? And what has God been doing? And what then is God's role in the continuing unfolding of the natural order? Right? So if I were conventionally religious, if we were talking about the dominant model, then I'll just remind you, God is outside of space and time. God knows everything, can do everything, and somehow is all good. I don't think that makes sense, but that's what we're told we're supposed to believe. Right? And God isn't at all physical. God is pure spirit. But here's some problems with that. One is, if God is purely spirit and the world is just physical, then how exactly does God make the sea split? Like, God has to interact with molecules of water to make them move. But we've already said that God is purely spiritual, not at all physical. We've also already said, by saying God's eternal, that God never is involved in actions, because those always happen in a particular moment. That's a change in a moment. And if God is eternal, God is unchanging. So there are some big problems with trying to believe in a Superman in the sky, but those are technical problems. The really big problem is, I don't know, if I was all-knowing and I was all-powerful, I think I could do a better job than the one I read about when I read the paper every day. Like, I, for one, if I could do anything, I would snap my fingers, or if I was like Genie on TV, I'd wiggle my nose and climate change would go away, right? And I would just stop the disappearing of different species. And I would make sugar the healthiest food you could possibly eat, seconded only by salt and fat, right? If I were an all-powerful God, not that I'm running for the position, that would be in my platform, right? So the fact that so many tragedies happen, that nature can be so harsh, so hard, to me, that poses a theological problem. And because most people throughout history have believed that to be religious means to believe in gods who can do whatever they want. And that got imported into Judaism and Christianity and Islam, that God is in complete control. That poses what I want to call the Pelican Crisis. So here I'm going to say my first little science nugget. Brace yourself. Some of you may know how pelicans reproduce across the generations. Pelicans generally lay 2 eggs. And the first pelican chick that hatches gets all the food and all the attention. The second chick that hatches is starved. The parents ignore it, or they keep attacking it. They peck at it and peck at it and peck at it. Often that second chick is pushed out of the nest and dies from the fall. But even worse, the pelican number 2 can spend a week inside that nest, slowly starving to death while being regularly assaulted by its parents. And the only thing that stops the assault is if pelican baby number 1 dies, then the parents shift all of their attention to pelican number 2. That's the only thing that will stop the attack and the starvation. Now, I don't know about you, it's very hard to believe in an all-powerful, loving God once you know what happens to pelicans. And you can multiply that story by the millions of times it has occurred in other species as well. Eagles do the same thing. And then you multiply that by all the other species that suffer unspeakable tragedies. Great apes like to eat meat. The meat they like to eat the most are monkeys. They catch a monkey, they pull it apart alive. They don't kill it first. They start to eat it alive. Monkeys are really smart. They can experience pain and terror and panic, right? This is happening every day in jungles across Asia and Africa, right? What kind of an all-powerful, loving God would intentionally make such a world? So that's one of the reasons that many, many people who drift to science also drift away from religion. They say, there is no order, there is no purpose, there just is. So if there were someone who created it deliberately, that someone would be a monster. But there isn't. It was just happenstance, pure coincidence from the beginning. And a lot of scientists believe that metaphysics. Okay, now we need to stop and we need to talk about what counts as science. Because part of what I want us to talk about is just because a scientist says something doesn't make that something science. It makes it the opinion of a scientist. And scientists are people, so they have as much right to opinions as the rest of us. But their opinions are not necessarily more valid than the rest of us, except when they're actually doing science. So here's what I want to give you as my definition of science. Science is the world's best method for advancing our knowledge of things that are public, replicable, and testable. I'm going to say more about that, but I just want to repeat it so you got it. Science is the best method we have for exploring things that are public, replicable, and testable. Let me help you internalize that by giving you examples. So public means the sun comes up every morning and it sets every night. Science is excellent at studying sunrises and sunsets. It's excellent at studying the movement of the planets, the movement of the stars, the movement of our planet in the sky. It can measure and record and test and compare and contrast. That's how science does its work. So once upon a time, we used to think that the Earth was stationary and the sun went around the Earth. By the way, that's a very reasonable assumption to make if you're standing at the shore watching the sun all day long. Okay? But it turns out there are some problems with that. If you assume a universe in which the Earth is static and at the center, and the sun goes around it, then you have to assume the planets are also revolving around us. And if you do that, then some of the planets reverse course for part of the year. And that's just weird. But you can get rid of this problem with what we think of as the Copernican revolution. Copernicus is the one who said, you know, the math would be a lot simpler if we just posit that it's the sun that's at the center and the planets are revolving around the sun, which is how our kids are taught in school today. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. This is not related to our main program, but by the way, both are equally true. In other words, if you want to assume a universe in which the Earth is the constant, it is reasonable to posit a universe in which the sun is going around that Earth. It's just going to make for some crazy mathematics. But it's just as easy to say one is the other, because the truth is they're both in motion, and they're not in motion necessarily relative to each other. Okay, if you didn't understand that, don't worry about it. Science is great for studying things that are public. What's your blood pressure? That's a science question. I know that. It's out there. I can look at it. Are rocks harder or softer than dirt? I can measure that. That's something I can know. The stages of life of a monarch butterfly. This is very big in my household right now because we've released about 30 in the last month, right? I can tell you a lot about chrysalises and caterpillars and butterflies, right? Science is great for things that are public, but how about things that are private? How good is science at things that are always private? I'll give you my favorite, for instance, consciousness. How good is science at studying consciousness? The answer is lousy. What science can measure is the functioning of brains, right? So science can measure which parts of your brain are getting heated up at particular times, where the neurons are flashing and where they're not, what kinds of interactions and patterns they are. They can look at areas of the brain that seem to light up for particular kinds of activities. But can you describe in brain terms what the subjective feeling wet is? No, you cannot. Can you tell me what, oh my God, I am in love, is in purely neurological terms? No, you cannot. We all have a hunch that brains and minds are closely related. I'm going to talk about that later when I get to slime molds, right? But what we can't do is talk about brains in terms of mind. And we've never made that leap from third person singular, which is neurobiology, to second person singular, which is you look across the crowded room, your eyes lock, and your heart goes pitter-patter. What's that emotion biologically? I don't know. I can tell you the shot of hormone that your brain just ejected into your body. I can tell you about your pulse. I can tell you about your sweaty palms. But the feeling of love, separate from all of that, as we say in the biology lab, ich weiß, right? No way to know, no way to make that leap. So any book on minds that's written by a scientist, in the last chapter, in the last paragraph, will tell you that we are just on the brink of solving the mystery of consciousness. Just on the brink is scientific for beats me, I don't know, right? But we're not just on the brink. They're never going to make that leap because of the metaphysical assumptions they make. Science is lousy at testing the inevitably private. The other thing it's no good at testing is the unreplicable. So I've mentioned a couple things that science has been good about, but part of why science is good about that is we can do comparisons. So for example, we measure everybody's blood pressure. And then we notice the correlation between certain regular blood pressures and certain medical events. And we say, here's a healthy blood pressure and here's a not. But we don't know if there was only one. If we only had one blood pressure and nothing to compare it to, then you would never know if a particular outcome was because of the blood pressure or something else. The great philosopher who established this is a guy named David Hume. He was a Scottish philosopher, very popular, bon vivant, invited to all kinds of parties. He would sleep until about 2 in the afternoon, write philosophy until about 8:30 at night, and then he would go to a palace for a dinner party where he would stay up way too late. Right? He tells the story of a baby turkey. Right? This turkey is born, let's imagine, in June or May. And the first morning, the farmer comes out and bangs on the turkey hatch, and the turkey sticks out its neck, and the farmer drops corn on the ground. This happens every single day for a week. Farmer's footsteps, bang, bang, bang on the hutch, turkey sticks out its neck, corn falls down. The turkey is a proto-scientist. The turkey says, oh, I understand what's going on. Bang, bang, bang is my invitation to make the corn fall down. My sticking my neck out of the hutch is what causes the corn to fall down. And in fact, there's empirical evidence. Every time the turkey sticks its neck out, the corn falls down. One day it does an experiment, it doesn't stick its neck out, and no corn falls. There's just another bang, bang, bang. So this confirms to the turkey that it is in fact causing the corn to fall by sticking its neck out of the hutch. And that continues to be the known and proven theory until one morning in mid-November, when there's bang, 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 and the turkey sticks out its neck, and the outcome is drastically different. Hume uses that little witty argument to show us we actually never see cause and effect. All we see, thank you, Robert, is that correlation is not causation. Just because A always happens right before B doesn't mean that it caused B. The only way you could know that is if you did lots of compare and contrast. You looked at all those turkey hutches, and then eventually you noticed that this was a pattern and this is why it happens, and it wasn't actually a cause. But we make that, the only way we can do that is if there's multiple of them to compare. So we look at lots of different biologies and we figure it out. We watch lots of different birds. But here's another funny one that you can't do that with. You can't do that with the universe as a whole. You can look at particular galaxies and compare them. You can look at planets and compare them. You can look at stars and compare them. But this 14 billion space light universe that we're in, you only have one of it. So you have no idea when you talk about the entire entity whether the generalization you're making is correlation or cause. To know that, you would need another space-time bubble to compare and contrast. But we have no access to that other space-time bubble, which means that everything people say about the totality, they're just taking the sum total of the parts and hoping that works for the totality. Everybody with me? But that's unfounded. There's no evidence for that. There's no proof of that. That's just a theory. So there are scientists who say this is the only space-time bubble that exists. And there are scientists who say there's an infinite number of space-time bubbles, right? Do they have any evidence whatsoever for an infinite number of space-time bubbles? Not a shred. They can't. You can't get out of our space-time bubble to go hunting around. So what drives them to make this really extravagant theory? It's a principle in science that you try to prefer the simplest possible explanation. The theory that there's an infinite number of alternative universes is the most extravagant of all possible theories. What drives them to that? Well, here's what they're trying to get out of. The number of coincidences that have to fall into place for the emergence of life and then for the complexification of life to our level is staggeringly impossible. Staggeringly, the level of carbon, the amount of oxidization that has to happen, the electromagnetic constant. I mean, the amount of things that have to line up precisely, a little too much this way, a little too much that way, we implode or we explode, right? So everything has to line up exactly right for 14 billion years for there to be one place with someone who can teach on a thing called Zoom. And if there's only one, then they're worried that, of course, us theologians are going to say, hey, I have a name for that one. I call that one God, right? And they don't want to do that. So what they say is, no. There's an infinite number of universes. And of course, if there's an infinite number, in almost all of them, there's no stability and no life. But of course, if there's an infinite number, then there's going to be one which happens to work out just right. And of course, there's going to be life inside that one. And that one is going to say, see, there's a higher purpose. All of this extravagant infinite number of universes just to be able to deny that there's purpose built into the universe. which, by the way, may be right. Remember I said that scientists have the right to have an opinion? They do. It's just no more science than my opinion. Because remember, if science is what is replicable and public and testable, then you have every right to say to a scientist who's spouting off to you, tell me, Mr. Scientist, is the claim that there's an infinite number of universes, is that public, replicable, and testable? And the answer is, my friends, it's not. Okay, so it's a speculation, could be right, but it's not science. So things that aren't testable, that's not science either, right? And then it has to be replicable, as I said, and you have to be able to have a way to test it. So someday we might be able to test whether there's life after death, right? Posthumously, on the other side, you'll all say, huh, son of a gun, I should have read Rabbi Spitz's book more carefully, right? And I'll just want to tell you that on the chance that he's right, and the soul does survive, and I believe that he is right, you'll probably want to practice your mitzvahs a little better and brush up on your Hebrew, because I think that's the language they're speaking behind the pearly gates. And when you get to the cafeteria, you want to be able to order the right things. Okay, so science is a method for exploring what is public and replicable and testable. Now here comes the big unanswerable question that's not science. Are there things that are real, but they are not public, replicable, and testable? In other words, does science have a monopoly on everything, or does it have a monopoly on a subset of everything, but there are other things that science can't weigh in on but are nonetheless true? Now, before you rush to give me an American Jewish answer, and the American Jewish answer is yes, science has a monopoly on everything. But before you rush to say that, I want to give you the example of my favorite scientist, which is Albert Einstein. Of course, he's every Jew's favorite scientist. If he's not, shame on you, right? So Einstein sits on a bed and he thinks, think, like Winnie the Pooh. And he comes up with an experiment of what it must look like to look at light when you're traveling at the speed of light. And he realizes that light is absolute. The speed of light is absolute regardless of your frame of reference, which is why it's called relativity, right? Relative to everything, the speed of light is constant. This changes everything. It means there's no absolute time, there's no absolute space, because light is constant. I'm not getting into that with you right now, why. But did he have any evidence for that? No. He just thought it with that great big brain of his, right? Does that mean it wasn't science? No, it was public and replicable and testable. He just hadn't come up with the test yet. So one of the things he came up with was the idea of curvature of light because of gravity. But you need massive distances to be able to measure it because it's just very, very little. And there were no tools in the 1930s, 40s that could measure it. Well, it turns out about a decade ago, they actually confirmed it. They came up with empirical evidence confirming the curvature of light because of gravity. Does that mean now it's science, but before it wasn't? No, it means it wasn't proven before, but he was right. Okay, so are there things that haven't yet been proven that could become proven? I believe there are. There are many things that we don't know now, that we don't even know how to know, that our great-great-grandchildren, if the species survives, they'll know. But not everything. I still think that consciousness will never lend itself to being tested because it's never public. It's always one cranium at a time. So it's always going to be beyond the reach of science. There's never going to be the capacity to go from our space-time bubble into another space-time bubble. That will always be beyond the reach of science. And frankly, most of us live our lives as though there are things that science can't know that are profoundly real. I'll tell you my favorite example of that. I have a friend who's a professor of physics in Pennsylvania. And because he's a physicist, he believes that everything that happens is predetermined. It's all billiard balls. It's all cause and effect, all the way back, all the way forward, which means you think you have a choice, but you don't. It's all predetermined. So he called me up one morning because he really needed to talk to his friend, the rabbi, because he had to choose where to send his daughter to school now that she was graduating preschool. And the choice was between the local public school and the local Jewish day school. So he wanted to discuss it with me. And those of you who know me, I have a tendency sometimes to be snide. I'm not proud of it. It just is what it is. I tell him that I have this tendency and I was predestined, so there's nothing I can do about it. He doesn't like that. But I said to him, why are you worried about where to send your kid to school? Because if everything is predestined, just open the door and kick her out and close the door and she'll go where she's supposed to go, right? Even the guy who is empirically trained to believe that our choices don't matter still lives his life as though choices matter. Can't help it. So let me now back away and talk about a different way of understanding nature, right? Because what's broken about that assumption is it shares the Newtonian assumption that space and time are absolute, that matter is dead, and that it's like billiard balls crashing into each other. But it turns out we know enough to know none of that is true. Matter isn't like billiard balls. Remember when we studied the atom in school and it was those whizzing pool table balls swirling around? It turns out atoms look nothing like that. That's not what your kids or grandchildren are learning in school now. They're learning about this blurry blob that has the possibility of being where the atoms are at any given moment in a molecule. But it's all potentialities, right? So at its smallest level, reality isn't solid billiard balls clocking into each other. It's different possibilities that become manifest when they're observed. The observer actually impacts the reality that they're observing. That's kind of voodoo mystical, right? But that's reality. And there is no absolute time and there is no absolute space. It also shifts based on the perception of the viewer. Okay, so what I want to argue here is I want to say there are things that are real, but that will never be subject to scientific analysis. Scientists should never give up. They should work on proving me wrong. But I'm here to tell you they will never crack consciousness so long as they think that nature is a bunch of billiard balls in absolute space and absolute time. That's a dead end. It won't work. They will never crack the universe as a whole because they never will have anything to compare and contrast it to. It also is not a great big set of billiard balls. And the last thing I want to say is because consciousness is so extraordinary, I want to argue that consciousness isn't just the frosting on the cake of dead matter, which is what most people think they're supposed to think. I want to argue there is proto-mindfulness from the very beginning. That from the moment of the Big Bang, everything in existence had its own appropriate level of interiority. That electrons, when the energy level changes in their circle, they bump into the next energy level to preserve their own interiority. I'm not saying that electrons say, oh, it's a little hot today, I think I need to dunk in the pool. I'm not saying they're self-conscious, but I'm saying there is the roots of mindfulness in the building blocks of matter, that it's not an add-on later. And the evidence for that, my friends, is that there are two ways of looking at this. We can look earlier and earlier chronologically in the life cycle. So we used to think that mindfulness actually kicked in after birth. Obviously only applies to people, and it only kicks in well after birth. Well, we know enough about embryos to now know, and I'm going to avoid the political possible consequences here, just to tell you some science, right? They've done tests where they've discovered that unborn embryos can discriminate the voice of its mother And if it has won the voice of its father from the voice of other people, right? Heart rate, hormonal shifts, the embryo will turn to the voice of its mother, right? That means not yet born, built into the embryo is discernment, is mindfulness. We never thought that was true. They had a case 2 decades ago of a man in a hospital in what they called a vegetative coma, right? And the doctors were pleading to his mother to pull the plug. He's dead. There are just reflexes. It's not real. Pull the plug. He's not going to come back. Too much brain damage, not going to come back. And the mother kept saying, no, 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 no. And one day, a plucky nurse came in with a chart of letters and tied a wire to his toe and held up Y and N. Can you hear me? And his toe moved the wire just a little tiny bit to the Y. Are the doctors wrong in saying pull the plug? Why? Are you ready to die? N. No. Turns out he had spent the last decade listening to his doctors wanting to kill him and hoping to God that his mother wouldn't back down, despite all the experts. We are seeing consciousness at levels we never expected. If you put babies in the same crib, I remember when my twins were born, Jacob smiled a lot, and the doctors kept telling him it was gas. And I kept saying, it is not gas, he's smiling, right? I believe he's smiling. He believes he's smiling. Jacob is autistic. He remembers things nobody else does. He says, I was smiling. So anyway, Shira and Jacob did not come home from the hospital at the same time. We put Shira in the crib, both preemies, put Jacob in the crib, and they turned to each other. We moved them apart, turned them again. They turned to each other by the time we come back. They were always turned to each other. If you underfeed puppies equally, the puppies are okay with that. If one puppy gets more food than the other, watch out for a fight. They have a sense of fairness that nobody taught them. It's just there from the beginning. Human babies have that same exact reaction, by the way. They've done the same experiment with people. Right? So mindfulness goes way, way back, but now I want to push it further. We said, well, that's just people. I remember when I was a teenager, I would read books about animal behavior, and the books would all talk about how you can't anthropomorphize animals. You can't talk about how they have human feelings. That's not right. They're like machines, and they look like they're having human emotions. And I remember as a 15-year-old thinking, this fancy professor has never lived with a dog. You just have to live with an animal, and you just know that's ridiculous. So we had a dog with very, very, who had a wonderful personality, Oliver, and she had been traumatized by men. So her default response to a strange man was to try to attack him. She was, of course, all of 15 pounds, so attacking meant trying to shred his ankles. As she got older, her eyesight wasn't so good. So I would come home from school and she would hear thud, thud, thud of what sounds like a man's foot, and she would start her attack bark. The door would open, she would go running out, I would be at the bottom of the stairs. She would still be barking ferociously to chase away this man. And then when she finally got close enough to see that it was the young master, well, that's embarrassing, isn't it? So what would she do? There'd be a moment of faltering barking, and then the barking would rev up again. And then she would go running past me into the street, bark, 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 bark. And then she would turn around, wag her tail to greet me, as if to say, I knew it was you all along. I was never barking at you, right? I could multiply stories like that. Anyone who's lived with animals can multiply stories like that. And by the way, the biology textbooks now talk about animals, of course, have similar emotional and cognitive features to us. That's where we get them from. But you're saying, well, sure, those are mammals. So I'm going to speed up a little. They used to think that bird speech was purely arbitrary. They were just echoing what they heard. Did you read last week there were a bunch of parrots who were shouting obscenities to visitors in the Danish zoo and they had to move them out? Let me tell you, we know those birds meant it, right? Because there are birds that now have conversations. Scientists have tested them. That great ape who sign languaged, tickle me, right? And you're my friend, right? They have minds, but here's the best of them. There was an experiment done with slime mold. Slime mold are single-celled organisms that live in community often, and they behave collectively. Now, what's interesting about them is they don't have neurons and they don't have brains because they're single-celled organisms. But here's what they can do. I'll tell you 2 stories about slime mold, things you never thought you'd hear from a rabbi. One, if you set up a maze on a big plate of glass with walls to make a maze, and you put food at the beginning and food at the end, within a half hour, the slime mold will have figured out the most efficient and shortest route to the exit. There are military professors who have used slime mold to predict the optimal route for their soldiers to convoy. Because you give them a topographical map, they'll figure it out. They'll do it for food. They won't do it to make one side win. But if that was a human, you would call that thinking. It's not random. They routinely, over time, find the shortest route. The experiment that I love the most is you put out a big plate of glass and you put some kind of protein on the plate, a liquid protein on the plate. You put a plop of slime mold in the middle. That's not a scientific term. And then you crank the temperature to room temperature. Slowly, the slime mold will expand to pursue the food. And then you turn it to freezing and they retract to be able to preserve themselves against the cold. So there was a guy who did that. 30 minutes of warm, on the minute of 30, cold for 5 minutes, then you turn it back up, expand. The first time there was a cycle of warm, then cold, and then 30 minutes later, the slime mold kept growing. At the second 30 minutes, that's now 60 minutes, turn it to cold, the slime mold contracts. It took 4 or 5 cycles. And then at the end of that 30-minute period, you know what the slime mold did at 29 minutes? It contracted. Because it somehow knew that it was coming. And he did further experiments where he would then go a couple cycles without turning it cold. The slime mold would grow through the 20 minutes. Correct, Matthew. It would anticipate. Right? That's a Rocky Horror Picture Show reference for those of you who get it, right? All right, the slime mold can enter. Now here's what it is nothing but primate bigotry not to call that thinking. It's nothing but primate bigotry to not call that anticipation. But that thing doesn't have nerves. It doesn't have a brain, but it is manifesting mind. Plants talk to each other. If you light a flame under a plant, it will communicate to the surrounding plants that there's a fire. They respond by emitting an enzyme that thickens the surface of their leaves to make them slightly more fire retardant. Plants talk to each other, right? Yeah, that chemical signaling is how plants talk. We primates confuse modulating air through an epiglottis as if that's the only way you can talk. But if we define talk functionally as conveying discrete information, plants are doing that. Bees can learn shapes. You can train bees to go to a triangle, and then you give them a triangle they've never seen before. It's a different kind of triangle, a different size, a different texture, different color, and they will still go to that instead of the circle. You can train them. That means they have the ability to abstract triangle. A bee with literally a pinpoint brain. So here's what I want to say in the 10 minutes we have left. I want to say the evidence appears to be that there is mindfulness baked into nature. It is not epiphenomenal. It's not something that gets pasted on at the end. The reason the scientists can never explain it is they start with a wrong assumption. Their assumption is matter is inert. matter is dead. And then what they can never explain is how do you, poof, suddenly have consciousness at the end of the process? The answer is you couldn't. But if mindfulness is manifest from the very start of the process, then all it is an upwelling of consciousness that becomes more and more complex, more and more sophisticated, erupts into self-consciousness at some point, erupts into spirituality, right? These things build on each other. Physics and then chemistry builds on physics, and then biology builds on chemistry, and then psychology builds on biology. But these things, while they're built on what came before, are not reducible to what comes before. You will never explain chemistry limiting yourself to physics terms. You will never explain biology limiting yourself to chemical terms. I want to be clear. What I'm saying is there's nothing additional except for organization, except for patterns. But those patterns are real, and that's called emergence. Nature is a fountain of emergent complexity, which breaks the rule. If nature is inert matter, isn't it supposed to go from simple to, from organized to less organized? Things are supposed to break and fall apart. But the universe we are living in has been growing more complex over the last 14 billion years, not less. So I'd like to suggest that's because the metaphysics are wrong. Dominant metaphysics, the same metaphysics that produced the all-powerful, all-knowing, eternal guy that has made such a mess of things, is the same metaphysics that says that matter is inert, and that emotions and consciousness and mindfulness erupted at the very end for reasons no one ever will explain. But I'd like to suggest that's got it backwards. I'd like to say, in fact, matter is ert. There's no such thing as inert matter. It's only a matter of timing. If you were living life with 10,000 years being a second, then the mountains would look like liquid to you. You would see the undulation of the planet. It's only the coincidence of how we perceive time that solids look solid and liquids look liquid, right? But that's not them, that's us. So nature, and here's what I want to end with for now, I don't believe in the supernatural. I don't think there's some realm of being beyond this realm. But I think that nature is super in ways we're just starting to let ourselves know. That this remarkable integrated pattern of energy allows us to connect to each other, to shape each other, to shape our future, to choose an open future. That nature is super, natural, and we don't need supernatural. And so the God that I believe in is the God who permeates this nature and continues to invite it to be self-surpassing, which nature has been from the beginning. If all matter were evenly distributed in a point of infinite density that then exploded out, that's the Big Bang theory, then in theory, everything should have been evenly distributed. But the amazing thing about the Big Bang is that within a fairly relatively short period of time, 300,000 years, give or take, matter started to be unevenly distributed. And it's because of that uneven distribution that we got the collections of gas that became galaxies or planets or solar systems, right? It's the imperfection that was built in from the beginning. That infinite point of density had that in it. It had that openness in it. It had that interiority in it. So what I want you to walk away with, at this point you're pretty puzzled, and I'll give some articles for Ari to distribute again, is that don't think about the world as a great big set of billiard balls. That's wrong. Think of the world as a giant cell in which every part of the cell is alive and contributing to the cell as a totality. The universe is more like an organism than it is like a pool table. And in this remarkably beautiful universe, nature has created an open future in which consciousness is what connects us all and links us with what's come before us. So that it's not just people who have it, it's not just mammals who have it, it's not even just living things that have it. There is mindfulness all the way down, right? And that is, I would argue, a far more explanatory description of the universe than any alternative. And next week, what we're going to do is we're going to take that to then, okay, so we have this notion of God who is not all-powerful and isn't coercive and who invites us into something, and nature like a banquet hall set for us, but also living and participatory, part of this cosmic cell of which we are members. Well, in that world, then what's Torah? What are mitzvot? And what kind of future can we anticipate? That's what we'll talk about at our next session.
Can I ask you a few quick questions to?
You can.
Okay, thank you. Since I basically muted everybody else, and I am in this world, pretty potent, right? I don't know everything, but I have a lot of power.
Don't go there.
Anyway, I won't go there. So just talk about process theology. We are down the rabbit hole, and now we're going to have a lot of dazed people. It's good for COVID because people are stuck at home. Otherwise, they'd be dazed in the shopping. They'd be buying random things in the store. I think we got to get them, just back up the rabbit hole with their knowledge that they learned. So hopefully they'll stay with us one more week. By the way, this program has also confounded science because every CSP program we've done, this is 110, there's always a 10% drop off. This program actually increased throughout the whole program. It just went up to like 126. It's very unusual. So I have to get some scientists to understand what's going on here. So the question is just about process theology. Thank you. This is Batman, so I have Batman here. How prevalent is process theology within? We talked a little bit before. Process theology comes from Christian thinkers, I think.
The original thinkers are from the Christian tradition.
And so how prevalent, how well known, what kind of role does it play in Christianity today? How prevalent is it in Judaism and Islam? Is there any particular movement that it's kind of taking a hold in that you know of? And
here's what I will tell you. It is well known within Christianity, and it is not prevalent. Mainstream Christians know about process thought and hate it. They hate it in part because it's not Trinitarian, right? You understand that mainstream Christianity decided God is 3 in 1, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Protestants believe that, as do Catholics. Process thought talks about God as being the process that unites it all. And what Jesus was an incredibly intuitive human being who made himself transparent to the lure. Right? If I can give you an example, that would be what Hasidim would say is true of their Rebbe. What you and I would say is true of Moshe Rabbeinu. Purely human, but who made himself transparent to the lure. And therefore, they want to be the students of that Rebbe. But Christians, non-process Christians, have real trouble with that. Of course, they have real trouble with not thinking that the soul is a thing and that it's inside your body, like Casper the ghost inside a machine. They have trouble with that. So process people, while they have this beautiful theology, don't have that many followers, and they get savaged by other Christian groups. I can tell you the Jewish process thinkers have had a very different experience. So my books on process theology were co-published by my denomination, the Rabbinical Assembly co-published the books. When I tell that to my Christian theologian friends, they're shocked that one of the major Jewish denominations would do that. I'm taught at Hebrew Union College. Every year I get invited by Zoom or in person to teach a session at HUC in New York and here on contemporary Jewish thought. I have a great advantage over many theologians in that I still have a pulse. But that's the biggest denomination teaching process thought. There are even Orthodox Jews who are interested in process thought. So I think how it ripples in Judaism is, my guess is most American Jews, to the extent they think anything theological, think something that's very closely related to process thought, which is why when I teach this at synagogues, At the beginning of the talk, everyone's scowling, and by the end, they're all saying, well, I've kind of always thought that all along. I just didn't know I was allowed to. I do have to point out, by the way, that someone's, Sheila, says that we should watch My Octopus Teacher. I want to point out, this probably won't surprise you, that as a teenager, I had a pet octopus. His name was Ichabod Clancy. I kept him in a big tank in my garage. I went to the beach and I caught fresh crabs, which I left in a mayonnaise jar in the refrigerator. My mother's a saint. You open the refrigerator and there'd be these live crabs tapping on the glass. But I would feed one to Ichabod every day. And he definitely had mindfulness. He could tell the difference between me and other people. Octopi share their feelings and thoughts by the color and texture of their skin. And he made it abundantly clear that he liked when I was in the room, but he didn't like when I brought a friend.
What about, and I don't know if we're going to get there next week, the question that Professor Hubbard asked. He asked two questions, actually. One was by email and one tonight. How does evil fit into this process theology?
Yeah.
Is there such thing as evil?
Yes.
And then if it weren't for humans, how would this all play out with regard to God? And
all right, so let me answer the second question because that's easier. And then we'll answer the first question next week because we do have to talk about evil. I talked about it a bit last time, the notion of theodicy within process, but I'm happy to do it again, Professor. But here's what I want to say about if there were no people. I am not a physicist. Here's the biggest difference between physicists and biologists. If you ask a physicist if you could rewind the universe to the Big Bang and then start it forward again, would it come out the same? And they will all say yes, comes out exactly the same, because they all believe in cause and effect, cause and effect. And if you ask a biologist, if you rolled it back to the Big Bang and then start going forward again, would evolution work the same? None of them would say yes, they all say no, because they're biologists and they're used to complex systems that go awry all the time. So what we know about life on Earth is that there would most likely be brains. Brains have evolved 5 separate times in the evolutionary history of life on this planet. That is to say, our brains are not descended from bee brains or from bird brains or octopus brains. Those were branches that separated out and produced brains. So chances are good there would be some creature that was thinking it was the pinnacle of creation. And maybe it would be descended from crocodiles. Maybe it would be descended from dolphins. Maybe, who knows? But there would be somebody giving a talk similar to this with a very highly developed brain. By the way, the advantage if it had come from cephalopods and not from primates is there'd be a lot less issues with anger management. The great apes have terrible temper tantrums, whether they're covered with hair and in a zoo or they're on Zoom. So what I do believe is that I don't think in any way humans are inevitable, but I do believe that self-conscious awareness mediated through brains was pretty close to built into the system, and that it would have come out in some species one way or the other.
So, boy, I feel like we're going to leave people now, as I mentioned before. Ahuva is going to buy an octopus, she tells me tomorrow by chat. So everybody, please come up with a good name for Ahuva's octopus.
Okay.
And we're all going to watch the show, My Octopus Teacher, and probably read up a lot about process theology for the next week. So, I mean, the major question is, as you mentioned, hopefully you will do, is bring us back to Judaism. Otherwise, there's no reason for us to continue with CSP.
Well, I never brought you, yes, I do. So remind me next time we're going to do a quick talk through the first 3-4 sentences of Genesis. Because I will bring you back to Judaism with that, but I needed to go through this whole long introduction.
Okay, everybody. So you're all invited back next week for the final in a 3-part series where everything will make sense.
And then
Your
we're going
lives
to
will
talk
make
about
sense.
Torah and Jewish law as well.
But now that you've told me about the apes and the anger management, I do understand the screaming and yelling that goes on in my house every night at 6 p.m. and why my living room couch system is torn up and it looks like
all they are doing is ontology is reproducing philology. They're just showing you what they were evolved out of.
Okay, everybody. Well, have a good night. I hope you've enjoyed this excellent part 2. And looking forward to having you back with us for part 3. So 8:34. have your evening drink, and go to bed. And we'll see you next week. I'll see you tomorrow.
Bye, all.
And see you in Israel on Sunday. Okay, please sign up. OCCSP.net if you don't know who we are. Have a good evening, everybody. Rabbi Spitz, we'll get you in next time. Gotta check your speaker there. Okay, good night, everybody. Good night, David Wilner. You want to say good night to everybody?
Bye.
Say good night.
Good night.
Sleep tight.
Good night.
Bye, guys.
Look what Alfred's doing.
Oh, Alfred, the butler?
Yeah,
I am trying to end this. It won't let me end. Okay, there we go.
Oh, Quilla.
They're all still there. I don't know. Maybe we're locked.